1964.
In 1960, a group of 4 young men from Liverpool got together and built a musical genre. By February 7, 1964, they had started gaining mass popularity in the US, and from then on, they used their new sound and celebrity status to advocate for social change and peace. It was July 6, 1957. John Lennon was playing in a Scuttle band called the Blackjacks with his school friends. A few months later, Paul McCartney asked to join. The group performed at many different venues, and later the band recruited George Harrison. As the group got more serious, Lennon's friends decided to leave the group, and it was just Lennon, McCartney, and Harrison. They started to play in bars and small venues. They became locally popular and started getting opportunities to do bigger venues.
All through an old agent. We first went there for a fellow who used to manage us, and Mr. Alan Williams of the Jacaranda Club in Liverpool, and he found the engagement, so we sort of went there and then went under our own steam.
They started doing live TV shows on May 5, 1960. They auditioned for Larry Parnes, a rock music manager. They were unsuccessful, but they were offered to go on tour in Scotland with Johnny Gentle, a British singer-songwriter. For the next few months, the Beatles played in 2 main venues in Germany for a sum of 106 nights. The 2 venues were the Indra Club and the Kaiser Keller. On November 21st, Harrison was deported to Britain for being under 18 without a work permit, and later in December of the same year, McCartney was also deported after being accused of arson. When they were able to travel again, the Beatles played multiple series of shows at venues such as the Entree Institute in Liverpool and the Top 10 Club in Germany. Most of these working nights, the boys would play all night, sometimes even to 8 a.m. The band made a total of 92 appearances at the Top 10 Club. Bert Kaempfert liked the band's sound and recorded 5 songs with them, most being covers of past songs by different artists. On July 1st, 1961, the Beatles signed their first contract for 1 year with Kaempfert. As the band's popularity grew, they continued to play several shows at different venues. They also put in an extreme amount of work and practice. On November 8th, Brian Epstein booked a ticket to see their show at the Cavern Club, intending to meet the Beatles and discuss a possible audition for a contract. After many more meetings at several different locations, Brian Epstein got the Beatles on audition for EMI, a British record label. Although they were unsuccessful, the Beatles liked Epstein and his drive, so they signed a contract with him, making him their first official manager. As Epstein tried to get the Beatles out of their contract with Kaempfert, he set the band up with a couple different record label auditions. The Beatles auditioned for Decca and EMI again before being accepted for a deal with EMI's Parlophone record label. But before signing, the Beatles recorded 2 more songs with Kaempfert to release them from their contract. In June 6, 1962, the band recorded their first hit songs, Love Me Do and P.S. I Love You. This first recording session was the beginning of the band's skyrocket to stardom.
While there is no exact explanation for the effect the Beatles had, the screaming girls, the mass hysteria over simply seeing them, one of the biggest reasons for the Beatles' incredible success was timing. They entered the music world at the perfect time. In 1960, England's National Service Program was ended. This allowed the Beatles to focus on their musical passion instead of being forced into military service. Adding on to this, England was experiencing a period of economic prosperity, and the baby boomer generation was reaching their teens. The Beatles' upbeat and happy sound was perfect for the time period. Another important cause of the Beatles was the firing of Pete Best. Best was the Beatles' original drummer, but was always the misfit of the group. While the Beatles were eccentric, always trying new things, Best was always sticking to the norm. The Beatles got an audition with George Martin of EMI Studios, who was impressed by the group, but not by Best. He felt Best lacked timing and asked the Beatles to part ways with him. While the group did not want to get rid of Best, they realized that this could be their only opportunity for fame, so they made the hard decision of firing him. They replaced him with Ringo Starr, who was already friends with the group. Starr was a better fit for the Beatles, matching their unique style. This firing of Best may or may not have affected the success of the Beatles, but it certainly was essential to forming the Beatles as we know them.
On February 9th, 1964, the Beatles performed on The Ed Sullivan Show, and their rise to extreme stardom began. According to legend, when the Beatles performed on The Ed Sullivan Show, all crime stopped due to everyone watching the performance. Although this is not completely true, a whopping 40% of the United States population tuned in to watch the Beatles' first live performance broadcasted on American TV. At CBS Studio 51, the Beatles performed classics such as I Want to Hold Your Hand, and All My Loving set was an instant success among listeners. However, critics seemed to dislike the Beatles' style of music. Shortly after their performance on The Ed Sullivan Show, Theodore Strongden of Newsweek wrote, "Visually, they are a nightmare. Tight, dandified, Edwardian beatnik suits, and great pudding bowls of hair. Musically, they are near disaster. Guitars and drums slamming out merciless beat that does away with secondary rhythms, harmony, and melody." Donald Freeman of New York Times said, "The Beatles' vocal quality can be described as hoarsely incoherent, with minimal enunciation necessary to communicate the schematic text. Even with such rotten reviews from critics, the Beatles were still able to sell more than 25 million albums in the U.S., approximately 80 million worldwide, in just 1964 alone." With the spotlight now shining brightly on the Beatles, they did not disappoint. They still to this day top the charts of sales in rock history, coming in at around 178 million sales of units. The innovation of the rock band expanded rock music. The band's increasingly sophisticated experimentation encompassed a variety of genres, including folk rock, country, psychedelia, and Baroque pop. The Beatles were also heavily involved in the rise of bohemianism and in the rise of social and political movements such as women's liberation and environmentalism. John Lennon once said in an interview, "We're bigger than Jesus now," due to the success and the popularity of the band. From the years 1964 to 1970, the Beatles dominated the top of the charts, hit after hit. While on the center stage, they also released music promoting their message of peace. One of their most notable was All You Need Is Love, released on July 7, 1967, during the Vietnam War.
On April 10, 1970, Paul McCartney announces at a press conference that the Beatles are coming to an end. By December 31st of the same year, McCartney files a suit to officially disband the group. Following the dismembering of the band, McCartney and Lennon went their separate ways, doing a lot of popular solo work. Harrison and Starr went their separate ways as well, but occasionally worked together. Their most notable recording together is their #1 hit, Photograph. On December 8, 1980, tragic news struck fans when John Lennon was reportedly shot and killed. Lennon was shot by Mark Chapman, an old fan who was incensed at Lennon's famous quote of being more famous than Jesus. After sustaining 4 gunshot wounds, Lennon was pronounced dead at Roosevelt Hospital. Following his death, 2,000 people joined in a candlelight vigil at Century City in Washington, D.C. to pay their respects. Hundreds crowded the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in a silent tribute to mourn his death. Previous bandmate Paul McCartney wrote a tribute song, Here Today, to mourn his death of his old bandmate. In his tribute song to John Lennon, Paul McCartney sang, "I still remember how it was before, and I am holding back the tears no more." Tragedy came along again for ex-Beatles and Beatles fans, as on November 30th, 2001, when former lead guitarist George Harrison died of lung cancer. Harrison was battling cancer for a long and grueling amount of time, until in his home in Los Angeles, he sadly passed away. The quiet Beatle may have kept to himself, but without him and his voice in the band, they wouldn't have came together as well as they did.
The Beatles have clearly made it through the test of time with music that is still prevalent today.
The music is timeless because it was simple, and the beginning stuff was simple, and the further along stuff was super in-depth. So the breadth of music that they created was just like nobody else has ever done before. They did everything from simple 3-chord songs to huge orchestrations, and just wouldn't they'd try anything. I mean, there's nothing they would be afraid of to try musically.
Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band was ranked the best album of all time by Rolling Stone magazine in 2005 on the 500 Greatest Albums of All Time, and also won 4 Grammy Awards. The Beatles were collectively included in Time magazine's compilation of the 20th century's 100 most influential people. In 2004, Rolling Stone magazine ranked the Beatles as the best artist of all time, and in 2008, the group topped Billboard magazine's list of the all-time most successful Hot 100 artists. The Beatles were also heavily involved in social change and promoted peace, environmentalism, and many women's rights movements. The musical innovations of the Beatles, combined with their commercial success, inspired musicians worldwide perhaps more than any other act in history.